Welcome to the Brief on Grief. I am your host, Walter Sanderson. I am so glad you are able to join us for our next episode. And in this episode, we will be picking back up where we left off from our previous episode, and this is part 2 of Comparative Grief. I'm glad that you joined us, and if you happen to have missed part 1 of our episode, Comparative Grief, you can tune in, see it on my YouTube channel, listen to it on a podcast on Spotify and iHeart. Well, let's jump right into it. You know, here on the Brief on Grief, we always talk about how grief impacts us and the things that we need to know to help us cope better. And so, like last episode, we talked about the negative responses and the dangers of comparing your grief to somebody else's. I told you this last week, we never want to do that. It is never helpful. I don't care really if you lost a parent and somebody else lost a parent. You lost your job, somebody else lost a job. It is never wise to compare your grief to somebody else's, because each of us have our unique way of the pain we feel, the sorrow we deal with, and how we have to cope and move forward. I was reading something based on some experts and also in my own pastoral experience in counseling. And it is stated that we don't want to compare grief. We don't want to compare that pain and sorrow. And based on the advice of experts, and like I said, my own grief counseling experiences, grief isn't comparable. I'm going to say that again so that somebody will hear me clearly. Grief isn't comparable because grief does not have measurable facts. And even those variables that we will come up with when we talk about grief, they aren't objective, but all of it is subjective. In other words, there is no expected amount of suffering and sorrow that you and I, or anybody you know, should feel, and I'm going to put an emphasis on should feel. But based on the loss you have, based on the loss that I have, we have really got to think about it, especially even in corporate America, where they tell you if you lose a spouse, if you lose a parent, you get 3 days off. And if you lose a grandmother or you lose a sibling, then it is 1 day off. And I'm here to tell you, even that in itself contractually is comparative grief, because even the national standard is we should be able to measure how many days somebody needs depending on the loss they have. And I'm here to tell you, you cannot determine how many days it takes for somebody or yourself to grieve a particular person in your life. Comparative grief is wrong, and comparative grief is an error at times, because my grief is not impacted by just the fact of who I lost or what I lost, but it is impacted by several factors. There are times that while one is grieving, he or she has not even realized the factors until they have received some counseling from a professional. And here is why that's important to note. Here's why we shouldn't compare grief. And if you are, please stop comparing your grief and comparing others' grief to yours. Because when we compare grief, we label, we don't know this, but I'm here telling you, we label the severity of another person's loss, another person's grief, based on how we felt when we endured it. And you and me and you and them and I are not the same. Many times, those who are hurting receive less support than they actually need because of comparative grief. I'm going to say that again, and I hope this helps somebody. Most people receive less support than they actually need because of comparative grief. All grief, your grief, my grief, matters. All of our grief matters. And for someone, your grief does not have to be significant to anybody else besides yourself, as long as it's important to you. It's not important based on what others say how you should feel. It's not important based on what others think or how you should be going through. It's based on your opinion and your opinion only. Because sometimes when people compare their grief, compare my grief, compare your grief, it is harmful and not helpful, because somebody is trying to tell me how to manage my grief without the emotions that I am going through attached to it. And even if you know somebody that experienced a similar loss, experienced the same loss as yourself, meaning just comparing a person, you lost your home, you lost your pet, you lost your spouse, you lost a parent, you lost a sibling. Even if they have lost the same type of person or thing, they should not compare their grief to yours. You have heard it said that there is no grief greater and experience than the grief of a loss of a child. Now, I want to be very compassionate and sympathetic to anyone who has lost a child, because no one knows your pain and sorrow except you. And even if you lost a child, you still shouldn't compare your losing a child to somebody else, because no one knows what it's like to walk in your shoes. And you certainly don't know what it's like to walk in mine. And many times people will try to put your shoes on because they go, well, hey, I lost a mother, so I think I know what that feels like. I think I know what her feet feel like. I know what pain she's going through, because you simply experienced a loss. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes the loss is too much for some people to bear because of other factors. Let's take a person who has lost a child, for example. Somebody may have lost a child during birth. A mother may have lost a child when her child was a toddler. Somebody's lost a child when they were a teenager. Somebody's lost an adult child even in their 20s and 30s. Now, many people would compare and go, well, it's harder to lose a baby versus a toddler and versus a teenager. But that is your opinion, and I'm here to tell you, stop comparing and keep your opinions to yourself, because it's not helpful. Many mothers will tell you, it does not matter if I lose my child at the age of 2 weeks, 2 months, 12, 22, or 42, that it is different for each mother, but the pain is not comparable. There are factors that would play into that, let's say for age, and then there's the factor of how the child died. Maybe someone's child died from sickness such as cancer. Somebody's child died from an unfortunate tragedy. Somebody's child died from an overdose. These are all factors that factor into how I cope with and deal with and handle my grief. And sometimes the reason you don't want to compare your grief is because one factor is some people struggle with the fact of, should this have happened and could it have been prevented? Sometimes is it the responsibility of the individual? There are so many factors to deal with, and I need you to stop comparing grief. And with that being said, I need you to know that the statement of losing a child isn't one that could be compared, because for many of us, you may not even know or ever know what it's like to lose a child. You may not even have a child, but you know what it's like to lose your parents. You know what it's like to lose your brother or your grandmother. And for you, there is no greater loss than the loss that you feel, the loss that's impacted you. And so I want you to know that comparing grief again It minimizes at times everybody's grief or somebody's grief that you know. I can share a personal thing with you. I have experienced many losses in my life. I've lost, and many of you know, lost my grandmother, whom I miss dearly and still cope with. I've lost uncles and aunts. But in 1998, that grief, just the pain of coping, of losing my Aunt Barbara in 1998 was so severe compared to the others. That's not to say that I don't miss my grandmother as much as I miss my Aunt Barbara or one of my uncles. Doesn't compare measurable in my grief. The fact in these circumstances was my Aunt Barbara was the first major loss in my adult life that I really understood and shook me to the core. It was unexpected. It was from an unfortunate mishap in surgery. And so there were many factors that changed and impacted my grief, as opposed to, let's say, an uncle who was 70 or 80 years old. My aunt was in her 40s and it was supposed to be a routine surgery. So this is why you can never compare grief, because if you ask me, I don't know anyone that I love more than my grandmother. But the reality of it is, it was tougher dealing with my aunt because it was the first time I ever experienced it. So sometimes when we compare grief, we forget that relationships matter, how close I was to the individual. For somebody, losing a grandmother doesn't mean much to you because you go, well, I never really had a relationship with the grandmother. My grandmother lived across town. I didn't see her much. But for me, I saw her every day. I spent time with her every day. I ate with her every day. I went shopping with her whenever she needed me to. And so it's just simple factors such as that change the relationship, which impacts us differently. For the most part, I just want to make sure that we stop comparing grief, because when you compare grief, you're actually telling somebody how they should feel, for how long they should feel, and why they should feel it. And grief is something that, again, that is unique to the individual, and you allow the griever to tell you how they feel and not the other way around. And so if you have been comparing grief, maybe just an error, maybe you think you've been helping somebody, I'm asking you from this point forward to stop comparing grief. Stop telling people how they should feel. And moving forward, when people have lost, moving forward in your own loss, remember it's a negative impact to compare your grief to somebody else's, because you're saying indirectly that someone's pain, you're saying indirectly that someone's sadness, you're saying indirectly that someone's tears are not significant because of what you believe it should be, because of how you believe they should be responding. And again, know this, your opinion is just that. It's your opinion. And as I stated in an earlier episode on the Brief on Grief, that our grief at times is a major blow, and it is followed by other contributing factors. And those factors take time for us to cope with, and at times it takes crucial moments for us to even understand it. Well, I just stopped by to make sure that somebody understands that comparing your grief to somebody else's is never a good thing. And I want you to make sure to not compare grief, but as I said in part one, don't compare. Just be compassionate to somebody that is grieving. Well, that's it for this episode of part 2 on comparative grief. And that concludes this episode on the Brief on Grief. As always, if you know somebody that would benefit and be encouraged from this message, please share and subscribe to the podcast. in the YouTube channel. And as always, we always know somebody that is grieving something or grieving, and that somebody might be you. See you next time on The Brief on Grief.